Okay, so today we're looking at two very important readings. The first is the development of the monist view of history by George Plekhanov. You can see he has a very fancy sort of goatee. And he is considered to be the father of Russian Marxism. He is considered to be the person that Lenin also followed in his day, and pretty much the entire Marxist movement followed until the Bolsheviks and Lenin took his other sort of course of action. But his early works are considered to be the foundational works of Russian Marxism, and actually not just of Russian Marxism, but considered to be some of the most important works of Marxism in general. And his book called the Monist View of History in particular is actually really very, very good. So it's from here that I'm going to summarize some of his arguments and put them in front of you. We are coming to the conclusion now in this course of the idea of materialism as developed by Karl Marx. We've been looking at its emergence over a long period of history, and what is happening with it with respect to the French, and then what is happening to it with respect to the Germans, and so on. And now we're coming to the close of this particular movement of history. Now, Plekhanov begins by telling us that idealism strives to explain all the phenomena of nature, all the qualities of matter, by these or those qualities of the spirit. So what is primary in idealism is the spirit. You can think of Hegel, as I drew him on the board. There's the spirit, and the spirit is really what is determining the movement of history. Materialism tries to explain psychic phenomena, that is all intellectual phenomena, by these or those qualities of matter, by this or that organization of the human, or in more general terms, of the animal body. Yani for materialism, history, etc., nature, everything is the motion, movement of matter itself, rather than something standing external to matter, which is moving matter. All those philosophers in the eyes of whom the prime factor is matter belong to the camp of the materialists, and all those who consider such a factor to be the spirit are idealists, regardless of where they stand on the metaphysical, dialectical divide, etc. But if you believe that matter is in motion, and that the motion of matter is reflected in ideas, etc. Ideas are themselves matter thinking about matter, a bizarre sort of idea, I know, but if you accept that, then you are a materialist, otherwise not so much. First and foremost, Plekhanov is against the idea of dualism because he's talking about monism. And what he says is that only really monism is a convincing intellectual position. Either you can be an idealist and then you have to be a complete idealist, or you can be a materialist, and in this case you have to be a complete materialist. You cannot, in other words, be a dualist. What is a dualist? A dualist is someone or a philosopher who believes that there are two kinds of very different substances in the world. There is, of course, matter, which we accept, we acknowledge, and there is the spirit. And the spirit, the mind, etc., is made of something non-physical and non-spatial substance. It's not a brain. Brain is something different from the mind. The mind is not merely the processes of the brain, but whatever the mind is, it is non-physical. So the way in which you think is non-physical for Descartes, for example. Monism is the idea that you can either be idealist, either there is the spirit and that is the only thing that exists, or there is matter and that is the only thing that exists. Okay? Either of those two positions is referred to as a monist position. Mono se nikla na. Monist means someone who believes that there is only one kind of substance. There is only spirit or there is only matter. They can't be both. A dualist is someone, as a philosopher, who believes that there are two kinds of substances. Matter is one and spirit is another. Now, for the dualist, the mind, the element that thinks, is a non-physical entity. You have a brain, everybody knows that, but the mind is distinct for the dualist from the brain. For the materialist, the mind is the brain is the mind is the brain. The operation of the brain is the mind. For a dualist, however, that is not the case. So for a dualist, the mind is non-physical. What does that mean? It's non-physical. It's like the soul. It is in fact the soul. It is not a physical process. Thinking is not a physical process. Dualism, says Plekhanov, was never able to reply satisfactorily to the inevitable question, how could these two separate substances, which have nothing in common between them, influence each other? So the question that Descartes was not able to answer, Descartes is the main dualist of this particular period, although there are many other dualists. Of course, Plato is a dualist, there are many dualists, but the point is, Descartes is the main person in the 17th and following through him into the 18th century who argues the position for dualism. And the question posed to all Cartesian philosophy is, if the mind is non-physical and the body is physical, how does the mind, this non-physical mind, communicate to the body to do what the body does? Because the mind, if it's completely non-spatial, non-physical, how does it get a physical thing to move or to function or to obey it in any way? And nobody could really answer that question. Today we don't do that anymore. Today we say, of course, the brain is the mind. But in the past, and even in many philosophers today continue to say that the mind and the brain are two separate things. The brain, of course, is, by the brain we mean the physical organ, the brain. The mind is, according to materialists, the operation of that physical organ. If the brain stops thinking because there's no blood pumping in it, then we say the mind is dead. We say that person is brain dead. He doesn't have a mind anymore. He's become a mindless zombie, right? So the mind is the operation of a physical organ called the brain. Whereas for Descartes, the mind is something that is not physical in any way, shape or form. Holbach and Helvetius both attacked Cartesianism and this idea of mind-body dualism and began to argue for a monist view of history, a materialist view of history. And mainly they relied on the work of John Locke from England to do this. Locke had already argued that all psychic activity of man was nothing but transformed sensations. So through our five senses, we feel things, and when we feel those things, those are the stimuli that create thoughts in our mind. So that's all there is to how we think and how everybody thinks. Therefore, if that is true, if that is how ideas come to us, they come to us from our five senses, as the empiricists maintain. If that is true, then all notions, all conceptions, and all feelings are the result of the influence of his environment upon him. Whatever my environment is, those are the thoughts I will have. My thoughts will be shaped by my environment. That's what Locke is saying. And from Locke, therefore, follows the ideas of materialism, which Holbach and Helvetius elaborate in opposition to Descartes. So, for example, Helvetius says, man depends entirely on education, which means whatever your environment is, that's how you will think. Education here doesn't just mean your schooling. Education means the sum total of all social influences. Whatever my social education, that's how I will think. That is directly taken from John Locke, and that is used now to attack Descartes. If this is true, then virtue requires not to be preached, they explain to us, but to be prepared. It's such a beautiful phrase, because nature makes man neither bad nor good. It's not correct to say human nature is good or human nature is bad or whatever. It's neither good nor bad. It's a blank slate, a tabula rasa, as Locke himself wrote. It's like this board over here, and experience writes on that board. So if you wish to combat man's defect, you must change his social environment. This was the conclusion of Lockean materialism. Virtue requires not to be preached, but to be prepared by the reasonable arrangement of social relations. Change the social relations, and your thinking will also change. You can tell people, do this, do this, do this, do this, till the cows come home, and they won't do it. But if you change the circumstances, their behavior will change very quickly. This was what these materialists were saying. But this was somewhat of a mistake as well. And there were very, very big loopholes in this kind of materialist thinking of the 18th century. They sometimes said that the views of man have absolutely no influence on his conduct, and that therefore the spreading of one idea or another in society cannot by a hairbreadth change its subsequent fate. if the environment is the only thing that affects me, then telling me, Taimur, doing this is a really bad thing, they said, will have no influence on me because I have to change Taimur's environment in order for my behavior to change. So from this they drew the conclusion that ideas have no role in history, that you cannot change somebody's thinking by preaching to them. Now to some extent that's true. At a mass level, if you change circumstances, thinking will change, behavior will change, manners will change, culture will change. And we see this happen when we take a Pakistani and we put him in a different culture, different environment, different country with different laws, their behavior changes. So to that extent that is true. But to say that ideas have no role whatsoever seems also to be a bit of an exaggeration. To say that telling Pakistanis, listen, we have to make lines, we have to stop doing X, Y, Z is of no good somehow or the other, seems to be a very vacuous kind of empty materialism. If the idea of any particular man are determined by his environment, then the ideas of humanity in their historical development, says Plekhanov, are determined by the development of the social environment, by the history of social relationships. So the first thing is, right now we were just talking about an individual in relation to society. Take Taimur Rahman and put him in Dubai, his ideas will change. But what about society as a whole? If you want to look at the culture of a society, the ideas of a society, the mannerisms of a society, you have to compare that to the history of their social relationships. For example, to understand why historical advances take place and why they take place in the manner that they take place, we would have to examine the history of the development of social relations. So we would have to examine social relations. That's the main thing that he's bringing in. Now, this ended up in a kind of a contradiction. When examining history, French materialists would conclude that social relations are governed by opinions. Now notice, pehle they were saying opinions are governed by social relations. Now they're saying social relations are governed by opinions. It's back to square one. Take, for example, the following contradictions. First they say, man's opinions are created by social relations. Okay? Social relations, conditions of life, we can use any term you like. Structure of society, okay? My opinions are going to be determined by social relations. Yet, what are social relations determined by? If you ask them that, they said they are created by opinions. What are opinions? The same thing as before. Man's opinions are created by social relations and social relations are created by opinions. It's like the chicken and egg problem. Man considers good those social relations which are useful to him, they wrote, which is correct. Yet the existing relations seem useful or harmful to people according to the general system of opinions. So if you asked the French materialists, which opinions would people like? They say the opinions, they would like the opinions that are closest to their general opinions. The general opinions are the ones closest to their social relations, and the social relations are formed on the basis of the general. It's like going back and forth. Take another example. It is a mistake to think that religion promoted moral improvement of mankind, they say. Yet at the same time they say mistaken opinions govern history. Superstition governed history. So how are the two things reconcilable? It's kind of like what I was earlier calling a loop. If you look at it from the point of view of explaining history, what it means is that we are just going round and round in circles like the chicken and egg problem. The opinions of man are determined by their environment, the environment is determined by their opinions. That is the sum total of what this kind of materialism came to. Both things are true. Of course it's true that my opinions are going to be shaped by my environment. It's also true that the environment is going to be shaped by our opinions as individuals expressed together. Both things are, they're not incorrect. They're true. But they also seem to contradict each other. The other more important thing is that it's kind of true but vacuous. It's not saying anything. A way out was sought in the idea of interaction. Okay, I have ideas, and ideas interact with social conditions, and social conditions interact with ideas. Ideas influence objective conditions influence ideas, and round it goes, the chicken and egg. And anybody who denied this interaction between ideas and social conditions was outcast and said, hey, he's very one-sided, he doesn't understand that both things affect each other. Manners influence the constitution, and the constitution influences manners. This was the conclusion that the 18th century came to. But there was a problem with this theory. The problem with this theory of interaction is, for example, it could also be said that the French materialists were wrong in saying that ideas mean nothing since environment means everything. If I say ideas mean nothing, environment means everything, anybody can stand up and say that ideas also play a role, which of course you know is true. If I say environment plays the main role, you say, but sir, ideas also play some role. And if I say the opposite, French materialists could be criticized for saying that the social environment is governed by general system of opinions. Anyone can respond that the social environment plays a role in shaping the general opinion. Yani ke if in a study of history, I overemphasize the role of ideas, anybody could say, stand up and say, well, you haven't really looked at social relations and objective conditions. And if I emphasized objective conditions, anybody would stand up and say, well, you haven't really looked at the role of ideas. So round and round in circles that went. Not that it's not true. Please understand, this is correct. Social relations are impacted by ideas. Ideas impact social relations. But if you want to do a scientific study of history, it's vacuous. It's not getting you anywhere because you want to explain how history moves forward. You want to explain how history happens. If you just say social relations impact ideas and ideas impact social relations, actually you don't explain anything. You don't end up explaining how does history unfold as a process. So it's not untrue. It's not that it's wrong to say that. It's just that it has no explanatory power. To understand history, we must rise above the point of view of interaction. We must discover that factor which determines both the development of the social environment and the development of opinions. There has to be a third factor that impacts both of these things. That's what we have to understand. What is the third factor that's moving both of these things forward? So this was the problem of social science as the 19th century came into being. This is where everybody was stuck. Now let's look at some works of history that Plekhanov talks about. Let's look, these are some brilliant works of historians, etc. But you will see, written in the 18th century, you will see that they run across these very same problems as elaborated by Plekhanov. What are the problems? Sismondi contested the doctrine that the geographical environment determines historical fate. So he contested the idea that geography determines the manner of people, opinions of people, or culture of a people. But he pointed out that people who live in one geography sometimes have, in one period of history, have one social system, one set of religion, culture, etc. And in another period of history, the same people in the same geographical region have another religion, a different culture, different set of laws and constitutions. If geography was determining their culture, then shouldn't it have been the case that their culture should have remained the same? Because the geography has not changed. But clearly, their laws have changed, their culture has changed, their religions have changed, their opinions have changed. So that was his criticism, right? He said that political institutions, therefore, he came to the conclusion, were more important than geography. Okay? So he switched it around. He's like, environment is not so important, what's important is government. Now, Francois Guizot argued that political institutions are determined by the civil conditions of man. He said, by what is law determined? By how is government determined? How is the constitutions made? How are political institutions made? He said they don't arrive from heavens or whatever. They are determined by the form of that society. By what? By what we refer to as the civil conditions of men. What were these civil conditions? He pointed out the relations of landed property. So he began to look at property relations as determining the civil relations on the basis of which government was created, on the basis of which culture, opinions, etc. were created. Then came Augustine theory, and he talked about the English revolutions as a struggle of the bourgeoisie against the aristocracy. So long before Marx, there were already people doing class analysis and so on. And again, it was the same thing that he was looking at, the conditions of property. And from property obviously comes both these classes. Aristocracy is one form of property, bourgeoisie is another form of property, and he's saying, look, these two things are contesting. Then came Francois Minet. He examined the French Revolution from the needs of the various social classes. So all of these three great historians began to now look at social classes and property relations as the foundation of history, even before Marx began to do that. But there was a problem. All three of them came to the conclusion that in the last analysis, manners, ideas, and constitution conditions, quote, both owe their existence to a third factor lying deeper, the civil conditions of men, their property relations, and this was a step forward. No doubt, this was a major step forward and so on. But there was a problem. The problem was that property relations also belong to the sphere of legal relations, right? The law stipulates private property, feudal property, any kind of property. So property is first of all a legal institution. So question then arises, how do these legal institutions come about? How does the form of property come about? When Guizot is asked, he says, well, we're not too sure, maybe it has something to do with human nature. When Augustine Thierry and Menet are asked the same question, they answer, well, it happens because of conquest. One country conquers another, and then they impose their forms of property on the other country. Historically, that's not entirely inaccurate, that is what happened, but you know, usse pehle koi aur conquest hogi, usse pehle koi aur conquest hogi, and so on. So you just end up in this series of conquests without explaining why. You can say how, and the how is correct, but you can't explain why. And that's the question we want to ask. Why? So the question of why could only be asked by then going back to the idea of human nature. The view of human nature as the highest authority which decides all knotty cases in the sphere of law, morality, politics and economics was inherited in its entirety by the writers of the 19th century from the writers of the Enlightenment of the previous century. That okay, so property has something to do with human nature. It's human nature to have property, etc. And how then does property evolve or change? They said, well, human nature itself changes from being just like you, when you're a child, you have a different nature, you mature, you're a different nature, and you become old, you have a different nature. So just like human nature goes from childhood to maturity, so too history goes from childhood to maturity. But again, this was the idea of evolving human nature was also very, very problematic. Well, firstly, human nature was considered to have reached some level of maturity, and that nature, since that is human nature, was considered to be invariable, although it developed into that, but once developed it was going to be invariable, it was going to be unchanging. Now, how could you explain the changes in history on the basis of an unchanging subject, which was human nature? If the underlying reason for all of history is human nature, then all the societies that you see should have the same history, because they have the same nature. Europe has the same nature as Asians, they have the same nature as the Africans, they have the same nature as the Red Indians, etc. Right? We're all humans. So then why is there so much diversity in history? You can't explain that. And you also cannot explain how these changes occur. When is this state of maturity reached? Is it reached or not reached, etc. So this was another contradiction. He says, thus we see that the French historians of the Restoration also failed to eliminate this contradiction. It only ended up taking a new form. They only substituted in the place of ideas determine conditions and conditions determine ideas. All they could say was, well, why does this all happen? It's just human nature. That's not really an explanation. These ideas were also taken by the Utopian socialists like Fourier, Saint-Simon, Robert Owen, and they also tried to say that, okay, laws need to accord with human nature. This is why Marx and Engels considered them to be utopian, precisely for this reason. The central focus of their whole study then now becomes human nature. Saint-Simon alone took a step forward by asserting that we must study the facts of the past life of mankind in order to discover in them the laws of its progress. Amongst the utopian thinkers, he was the only one who actually said, no, we have to understand the laws of history. There are laws of history and we need to understand them. He pointed that, just opening up that question was a big thing that he did, right? Only he is capable of foreseeing the future who has understood the past, he said. Right? He's not able to answer that yet. He comes close to the answer, but he's not able to fully even answer it. Saint-Simon comes very close to the idea that the requirement of industry determine the organization of society when he declares, quote, politics is the science of production. So he comes very close to the idea that somehow production has something to do with how politics happens and so on. He was close and yet so far. For production, the implements of labor are necessary, right? You need tools. These implements are not provided by nature ready-made, they are invented by man. Tools are created by man. The invention or even the simple use of a particular implement presupposes in the producer a certain degree of intellectual development. So you have to develop yourself intellectually in order to develop the tool with which you're going to do the production. The development of industry is therefore the unquestionable result of the intellectual development of mankind. So by industry we don't just mean big industry, whatever we mean, any kind of work, the development of work here develops in turn the intellectual power of mankind and so on. The development of knowledge is for him the fundamental factor of historical advance. He got that right. He tries to discover the laws of that development, thus he establishes the law of 3 stages. What 3 stages did he give? Theological, metaphysical and positive. He said human history has gone through 3 stages. What are the 3 stages? Theological, early stage, metaphysical and now positive science. But what were these 3 stages? This is the childhood of humanity, theological, young adulthood of humanity and maturity of humanity. He went all the way back to that whole idea of human nature and got stuck there. Okay, he couldn't move beyond that concept of human nature. He couldn't really escape that paradigm, so to speak. What was the problem? If the key to understanding of history is provided by the study of the nature of man, what is important to me is not so much the study of the facts of history as is the study of human nature itself. Now, if human nature is said to be at the foundation of the development of man, then what do I need to study? Human nature, right? Once I've acquired the right view of the latter, that is of human nature, I lose almost all interest in social life as it is and concentrate all my attention on social life as it ought to be in keeping with the nature of man. The whole question becomes transformed. Once I have determined that human nature is this way, I forget about history and the only purpose of looking at history is to say whether history or society accords with human nature or whether it does not. And so I create this subjective, very highly subjective idea of human nature, or I may even abstract it from the nature of humans that I see in my own society. And I then just constantly counterpose whether history accords with what I have understood human nature to be. And in that way, this whole experiment becomes, this whole methodology becomes very, very problematic and vacuous and subjectivist and really actually quite fatalistic and empty. This creates a view that is fatalist in history and utopianism and subjectivism in practice. Fatalism in general marches frequently hand in hand with the most extreme subjectivism, writes Plekhanov. What is subjectivism? Such thinkers did not think about what is actually happening in society. Their main concern was what ought to happen in society that accords with human nature. So the task of social science in the 19th century has been, amongst other things, to build a bridge across this evidently bottomless abyss. So long as we do not build this bridge, we shall of necessity close our eyes to reality and concentrate all our attention on what ought to be, as the Saint Simonists did, for example, which naturally will only have the effect of delaying the transition into life of this what ought to be, since it renders more difficult the forming of an accurate opinion of it. First, he's saying you can't begin by saying what ought to be extracted from abstract human nature. First, you have to understand what is, objectively speaking. So the Saint Simonists, in that sense, and others like him, Auguste Comte, the great founder of sociology, is really a follower of Saint Simon and takes from Saint, without giving him full credit, takes the whole theory from Saint Simon and passes it off as his own. And so the whole purpose of Comtean positive sociology just becomes we have to understand the psychology of human nature, and then by understanding that we have to build society in accordance with that psychology and so on. If the cause of all historical social progress is to be sought in the nature of man, and if society consists of individuals, then the nature of the individual has to provide the key to the explanation of history. The nature of the individual is the subject of physiology. So physiology becomes central to sociology. Okay? Sociology की methodology ये बन जाती है. First I need to understand human nature, then I see whether society accords with it or not. This they call social physics. And this branch of sociology wasn't so much interested in what was actually happening as it was interested in saying what ought to happen. Naturally, this was also a very, it was a methodology that could not yield very positive results as far as scientific evidence was concerned, because the only purpose in it of looking at the objective world was to see whether it or not it accorded to your schema of things, rather than deriving a schema or deriving a theory by the examination of facts. You had created this subjective theory about what human nature was, and all you did was now to see whether reality accorded to your theory or not. French materialism therefore displayed an astonishing and today scarcely credible feebleness every time it came upon questions of evolution in nature or in history. The other major defect was that it was very metaphysical. It was fixed, like human nature is fixed. French materialism was also metaphysical. They could not understand social evolution. And whenever they looked at, for example, the history of religion, all they could say about it was that it was religions were created, these bad religions were created out of the cunning of priests and so on. They couldn't explain how those religions came about from the very objective conditions of those societies. So this meant that French materialism was impotent in the sense that it could not really give any great scientific output beyond a certain point. And it was also considered dry, gloomy, and melancholy by Goethe, who says the materialists in their view of history took up a purely idealistic standpoint that opinions govern the world. Whenever it came to looking at history, they just let that go and said opinions govern the world and human nature governs opinions, and that's that. So such materialism was essentially fatalist and left no room for the foreseeing of events, for the conscious historical activity of thinking individuals. Remember the question you asked me in the previous class when you said that how human agency had been robbed? This is the materialism in which human agency doesn't exist, because if environment shapes your opinion, then what's the point in changing your opinion? Because environment is going to shape it. And if human nature shapes your opinion, then what's the point of telling you anything? Because I can't tell you anything against your nature. Whatever happens is going to happen according to your nature. And thirdly, if something happens that's not according to your nature, how do I explain that? I can't explain that except by just saying it's an absurdity, it's against nature, it's terrible, it's irrational. And then you end up with this kind of weird formula that the history of the world has just been a history of irrationality. How can that be true? That itself is a kind of absurdity. Liberals, in the context even of Pakistan, continue to do this, continue to think about everything that existed in the past as just being merely irrational. But they take from the French materialists exactly this methodology. Hegel was the first person to say, this is not the way to look at history. This is not the way to understand it. He brought idealism to life back precisely because he began to challenge metaphysics. One second. Listen, we've heard this argument a million times, haven't we? Probably in Lump's classes as well. Oh, that's just human nature. Why did he do that? Oh, it's human nature. Why do politicians lie? It's just human nature. Why are some people greedy? It's just human nature. Why are some people not greedy? It's just human nature. Everything is human nature. It's actually not explaining anything. It's like when religious people say, why does this happen? Oh, because God wants it. Why does that happen? Oh, because God wants that. Why does the other thing happen? Because God. It's not explaining anything. Really? You know what I'm trying to say? It's not actually explaining why things are happening. It's just ascribing it to something, to human nature, which itself, is actually fluid and changing all the time. So Hegel was the first to say this is a metaphysical view of the world. There's no such thing as an invariable, immutable human nature. Okay? That's wrong. He says, and it doesn't matter whether for Hegel, it didn't matter whether you're religious or you're a materialist. You could be a metaphysical materialist and you could be a metaphysical idealist as well. So you could be religious or you could be an atheist, didn't matter. But what was this metaphysical thinking that he attacked? He said, failing to understand the process of development of phenomena. That was the major failure. They represented all these phenomena as petrified, disconnected, incapable of passing one into another. To this point of view, he opposed dialectics, which studies phenomena precisely in their development and in their interconnection. So he is the first one to say, listen, all of this evolves. Human nature evolves. Nature is changing. Nature itself is changing. Human nature is also changing, and so on. There's a progression happening over here. The metaphysical thinking that philosophers had inherited from the Middle Ages thought that that everything is gradual. There are no leaps in nature, they would say. This is exactly what Hegel wanted to challenge. He said, listen, things change and they develop in leaps. By leaps, he means that quantity transforms into quality. Qualitative changes occur. Small changes lead to, as I said, big changes. Okay? It's not just that small changes are adding. A certain number of addition at a certain time changes the very essence of that thing. Have you ever seen that wonderful experiment where they take water and then they lower the temperature to 0 degrees? It's still water, but the temperature is now at 0 degrees. And then they take that bottle and they thak karke throw it on the table and boom, it turns into ice. Have you seen that? It's a beautiful, beautiful thing that just Google it, you'll see it. You give a shock to the water molecules and they crystallize suddenly because they're already at 0 degrees. That's a leap. The state of that water has changed from liquid to solid. And it happens like that instantaneously. It doesn't happen कि थोड़ा सा पानी ice हुआ, फिर थोड़ा सा हुआ. No, it just crack. All of it, if it's at 0 degrees, all of it goes into ice in like an instant. So that's what we mean by leaps. And that's what happens in history, that's what happens in nature, and that's what happens in society. That's what Hegel refers to as a negation. The thing that was before is not what it is now. It's changed. The supremacy of metaphysical thought was once so powerful in natural science that many naturalists also thought that evolution only occurs slowly and gradually. They did not see that evolution can there be. He's talking about Darwin here. He's criticizing Darwin. They could not see. And much later this was proven actually, what we call punctuated equilibrium, that evolution can become steady and steady and steady and steady if there are small quantitative changes, but there are no qualitative changes. And then boom, suddenly, there are all these new species that develop. And then the same thing it goes into equilibrium stasis and continues like that for a long time. And then boom, there are sudden changes again. And there are explosions in that sense. Well, explosions is a pretty big word for something that happens over hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions of years, but you get the picture. So Hegel bitingly ridiculed it and demonstrated irrefutably that both in nature and in human society, leaps constituted just as essential a stage of evolution as gradual quantitative changes. Both kinds of changes occur in life, in nature, in societies, everything. Gradual changes, and then suddenly, boom, big changes, leaps, explosions, qualitative changes, revolutions, in other words. Both things happen in nature. A lot of people mistakenly think, taken from the work of Fichte, that Hegel is only about the triad, okay? The thesis, antithesis, synthesis wala thing. That's not Hegel. Likhta hai Plekhanov correctly that not once in the 18 volumes of Hegel's work does the triad play the part of an argument. It's not the basis of his argument, okay? He may extract the triad by looking at something, but it's not the starting point of his argument. The triad only follows from one of Hegel's principles. It does not in the least serve him as the main principle itself. It's not his main principle. So if you say Hegel is all about thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which is pretty much what 99% of people say, that's not correct. Yes, that's one part of it, but it's not the whole of Hegel. What is it? What is the whole of Hegel? The whole of Hegel is this idea of totality of empirics. What is that? On every page of his work, Hegel constantly and tirelessly pointed out that philosophy is identical with the totality of empirics, that philosophy requires nothing so insistently as going deeply into the empirical sciences. Material facts without thought have only a relative importance. Thought without material facts is a mere chimera. Philosophy is that consciousness at which the empirical sciences arrive relative to itself. It cannot be anything else. So, in other words, Hegel is saying, no. You have to look at the holistic situation and empirically look at the facts and then derive any theoretical idea from the facts. That's where you have to begin. Truth is the supreme goal of thought, said Hegel. Seek truth, for in truth lies good. Whatever truth may be, it is better than falsehood. The first duty of the thinker is not to retreat from any results. He must be prepared to sacrifice his most cherished opinions to truth. Error is the source of all ruin. Truth is the supreme good and the source of all other good. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, what about this truth? He says there's no absolute truth. We're searching for the truth, but there's no absolute truth. The truth, he says, is concrete. What does he mean? He means by this that good and evil were judged, if good and evil were judged without any examination of the circumstances and causes that give rise to a given phenomena, that these general abstract aphorisms were unsatisfactory. There's no such thing as good in and of itself, and there's no such thing as evil in and of itself outside of its circumstances. Lying can be good or bad depending on the circumstance. Murder can be good or bad depending on the circumstance. Yes, after all, in war, in defensive war, in wars of liberation also, you take lives, right? So, or rather to put it another way, to take a life. Violence can be good or bad. It depends on the situation. If somebody is coming to steal and you are like, I'm non-violent, you know, and you don't do anything, that's not good. It's good if you resist and you say, no, you can't do this to me, etc., or to someone else. Every object, every phenomena has its own significance, and it must be judged according to the circumstances, the environment in which it exists. So important, so very important. You take something out of the environment, it gets out of context. You take it out of context, you have already wrecked any real good examination of that. This rule was expressed by the formula, there is no abstract truth. That means you can't take something and take it out of its context and make it into an abstract truth. Okay? Truth is concrete. It is situated in a concrete given situation. You have to look at it in that condition. A definite judgment can be pronounced only about a definite fact after examining all the circumstances on which it depends. So you have to look at everything in its context. So if you look at religion, you look at the lives of the prophets, you look at the lives of Julius Caesar, you look at whose life you look at in history, you cannot remove the context from the actions of that person and judge the actions of that person outside of the context of that history. You cannot do that. You might come to a positive judgment, you may even come to a negative judgment, that's your thing. But any decontextualized judgment is, according to Hegel, absolutely incorrect. It is positing an absolute truth, whereas truth is concrete, not absolute. The task of the philosopher to judge any given social system, etc., is to contextualize it within its history. The absolute is something that history is evolving towards, hasn't arrived then and there, although in his own mind he thinks he's arrived at it with his own philosophy, which is exactly how Hegel contradicts himself. जहाँ पे मार्क्स और एंगल्स को पकड़ लेते हैं, कहते हैं एक तरफ तुम कहते हो ट्रूथ इज नॉट एब्सोल्यूट, इज कॉन्क्रीट, और दूसरी तरफ से फिर तुम कह देते तुम्हारा अपना फलसफा एब्सोल्यूट हो गया, हाँ पकड़े गए, ठीक है ना. He contradicts himself. So now here Marx and Engels and Plekhanov, etc., are developing the dialectical part of Hegel, not his conservative aspect. So what is the dialectical part? Everything is changing. Eternal change of forms, eternal rejection of a form brought into being by a particular content. Dialectics teaches that forms change eternally in consequence of the higher development of their content. Things are always changing and developing further. Today, it promotes the satisfaction of certain social needs. So a particular form, a particular law, a particular cultural practice may be valuable and necessary precisely in view of those needs. There were certain social needs that that particular law or culture or norm or opinion fulfilled. Then it begins to satisfy those needs worse and worse. Somehow that law doesn't really do the job that it was supposed to do. Finally, it is transformed into an obstacle to their satisfaction. The very thing that caused things to be successful becomes an obstacle to that success. From something necessary, it becomes something harmful, and then it is destroyed. That's how history proceeds. That's how ideas develop. That's how laws change. It's not that all those laws were always bad, that we inherited from the past. It's just that those laws were applicable in the past. They solved certain needs. Those cultural traits solved certain things and issues in the past. They don't solve them anymore because the society has changed. The conditions have changed, and so on. That's what Hegel is teaching us. So one could not think of a greater triumph for a philosopher, even though readers continue to ignore Hegel. Every advance in natural science really showed that Hegel was quite right in his law of negation, how through disassociation from one plant to another, the life cycle continued. So dialectical thinking, therefore, he says, excluded all utopias. What does that mean? Everything flows and everything changes. If every phenomena negates itself, if there is no such thing, no such useful institution as will not ultimately become harmful, changing in this way into its own opposite, it follows that it is stupid to seek for perfect legislation, and that it is impossible to invent a structure of society which would be the best for all ages and all peoples. Everything is good in its right place and at the right time. So things are good in their right place and time. Truth is concrete, and then it transforms, it changes, etc. You cannot have any system whether it is religious, it is secular, it is liberal, it is socialist, it is communist, that is true for all time and good for all time and a perfect society and a perfect system. Listen, that cannot exist. There's no perfection, because life is all about evolution. Life is all about change. Change is the only constant. And as life and societies change, you have to change the laws to accord to those new conditions. That's not a process that will ever end. It's just a continuous way in which human historical evolution takes place. That's the law of human evolution. And philosophy, therefore, is the intellectual expression of its own age. No philosophy is right or wrong in that sense. Every philosophy is true for its own age and mistaken for any other. If you want to understand why Christianity arose in the conditions that it arose, you have to understand what were those conditions that Christianity was addressing. And why was it later that the very Christians overthrew the Christianity that they themselves fought for, or their grandchildren, great-great-great-great-grandchildren overthrew it, is because it no longer served the purpose that they wanted it to serve. So ideas in this way continue to evolve and change. This leads us to the idea of freedom and necessity. The idea that freedom is something where you can do whatever you like is an absurd sort of idea. Freedom, in fact, is the recognition of necessity. When you understand how why certain things were necessary at one time, why they become unnecessary at another time, that's when you understand why history is unfolding the way it is, and that gives you power. That gives you real freedom, or to make sure that that can ensure that you get to do the things that you want to do. He says the spiritual activity of man is subjected to the laws of material necessity, but this in no way destroys human freedom. Just because you are part of nature, and hence the laws of nature are also applicable to you, does not mean that, oh my God, this has destroyed human freedom. If we accept this, does this mean we've destroyed human freedom? No. What it means is that we've changed the concept of human freedom from the idea that you could do anything at any time, which you can never do. And you could never do that because you're part of nature. The laws of material necessity themselves are nothing else than the laws of action of the spirit. Freedom presupposes necessity. Necessity passes entirely into freedom. By understanding the necessity of something gives you the freedom to be able to do the things that you want to do. World history is progress in consciousness of freedom, says Hegel, progress which we must understand in this necessity. Okay? So in its necessity. So that is what gives you real freedom. Therefore, for Hegel, history is nothing but applied logic. Logic in the abstract ideas of logic are applied in history, and that's how history moves forward. But Hegel himself is conscious of the fact that if we look at the interaction of morals and an environment, that there has to be a third thing that moves both the environment, the conditions of life, the natural conditions in which we live, the structure of society. Society is changing, ideas about society are changing, but something is changing both these things. What's that third thing that is changing both these things? Hegel calls this the idea, the Geist, the spirit, etc. That's changing it, derived from the laws of logic. Every people puts into effect its own particular idea, and every particular idea of each individual people represents a stage in the development of the absolute idea. There's an absolute idea, we're evolving towards it. Every stage in our development, we apply that, and it continues to develop into the absolute. So he says that third thing that is driving history forward is this idea, the Geist, etc. But this solution was obviously not really convincing. And Feuerbach came and he overturned it. He said this is wrong. By personifying our process of thought in the shape of an absolute idea, and by seeking in this idea the explanation of all phenomena, idealism therefore led itself into a blind alley, out of which it could emerge only by abandoning the idea, by saying goodbye to idealism. Okay? It became very clear that this was not going to work. What was good in Hegel was the notion, the argument that everything is evolving. What was not really great in Hegel was that everything was evolving out of a Geist that had existed from eternity and would exist till eternity, and that somehow we were moving towards the absolute knowledge of that Geist. Materialism rose again, enriched by Hegel. Young Hegelians wrote, for example, Edgar Bauer writes, the dominating force is man himself. Insan ye sab kuch kar raha hai. His consciousness of self and reason is only the strength of that consciousness. It's not some idea in the abstract, etc. Consequently, there is no absolute reason, but there is only reason which changes eternally with the development of consciousness of self. It does not exist at all in its final form. It is eternally changes, says Edgar Bauer. And in this regard, of course, he is quite right. Marx also agrees with him. So this whole thing of the idea is now thrown about. And if it's not determined by idea, then what is it determined by? अब वो जो third factor था वो तो ढूंढना है. So what is the third factor? Hegel ने आपको मैंने पहले बताया था, said that the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, which means the social changes already occur, and then the philosopher says, oh, this is what happened. For the young Hegelians, the owl of Minerva flew at dawn, which means that it's the philosopher that does it. The Superman standing above society, who is above the mass, is the person who's doing it. So from the point of view of critical criticism, yani ki the young Hegelians, all great historical conflicts amounted to the conflict of ideas. They reduced it to the conflict of ideas. Marx observes that ideas were worsted every time they did not coincide with the real economic interests of that social stratum, which at the particular time was the bearer of historical progress. But again, you could just make the same criticism against the young Hegelians that was already being made, in the 18th century, which is that if ideas do not accord to your interests, then nobody will support them. And that's exactly what Marx said. Why do people adopt certain ideas? You haven't answered that question. So Marx writes, he says, I became convinced, Marx saying, after reading all these people, that legal relations as well as forms of state. Now note that he is reading the 18th century historians who were writing on the history of the French Revolution, the English Revolution, the Roman state, etc. He's reading also from German idealistic philosophy, the French materialists. And after reading all of this, he says, I've come to the conclusion that legal relations as well as forms of state are to be grasped neither from themselves. What does this mean, from themselves? It means that they do not come about from some internal process of the development of that idea, nor from the so-called general development of the human mind, nor is there a kind of human mind standing above history that is developing, etc., or like Hegel says, and all of these things are developing as a consequence of that, but rather have their roots in the material conditions of life, the sum total of which Hegel, following the example of the English and Frenchmen of the 18th century, combines under the name of civil society. That, however, the anatomy of civil society is to be sought in political economy. So I came to the conclusion that you have to examine political economy to understand how state develops, because state is developed by society. Society is developed how? To understand that you have to study, he says, political economy. To understand political economy, you have to begin by realizing that man is a tool-making animal, because political economy is about the study of how man produces. The great scientific service, therefore, that Karl Marx rendered humanity is this, that he approached the question from the diametrically opposite side, and that he regarded man's nature itself as the eternally changing result of a historical progress, the cause of which lies outside man. By outside man, he means here that it's not somehow that we are thinking, just kind of on our own in some abstract realm about the laws of logic because of which society is progressing. None of that. In order to exist, man must support his organism, borrowing the substances he requires from the external nature surrounding it. We have to eat, we have to live, we have to sleep, we have to find food. All of these things are necessary, and of course procreate. This borrowing presupposes a certain action of man on that external nature. We have to act on nature in order to live. But acting on the external world, by acting on the external world, he changes himself. By engaging in production now, man also changes his own ideas. So in production, Marx writes, men not only act on nature, but also on one another. They come together to produce. They produce only by cooperating in a certain way and mutually exchanging their activities. So they work together and they start to exchange. In order to produce, they enter into definite connections and relations with one another. And only within these social connections and relations does their action on nature, does production take place. So they have to come together as a society of some sort, start producing, and in that act of production as well as working together, they are shaping themselves individually as well as collectively. So Marx concludes, these social relations into which the producers enter with one another, the conditions under which they exchange their activities and participate in the whole act of production, will naturally vary according to the character of the means of production. Yani the tools available, the means through which production takes place. What kind of social relations you create depend on what? On the means of production, he's saying. With the invention of new instruments of warfare, here's an example, firearms, the whole internal organization of the army necessarily changed. The relationship within which individuals can constitute an army and act as an army were transformed, and the relations of different armies to one another also changed by the invention of one thing, firearms. Thus, the social relations within which individuals produce, the social relations of production change, are transformed with the change and development of the material means of production, the productive forces. Just like firearms changes the way armies fight and even are organized internally. In the same way, the development of technology and productive forces changes the way in which we relate to each other, our social connections. Look at the internet today. Look at the nature of our friendships today. With social media, we have friendships with people that whom we don't even meet for years on end. Okay, if only social media were around in the 1990s, then I could have had that long distance relationship that I was so looking forward to when I went to study in college, etc. But no, it got destroyed obviously because we were just doing letter writing, which would arrive after 1 month. There was no WhatsApp back then, right? Things have changed. All of that is changing. That was just a joke. Nobody laughed at it, but it was just a joke. The relations of production in their totality constitute what are called the social relations, society, and specifically a society at a definite stage of historical development and a society with a particular distinctive character. Ancient society, feudal society, bourgeois society are such totalities of production relations, each of which at the same time denotes a special stage of development in the history of mankind. So what is that third thing that is moving opinions as well as social conditions, etc.? What is that third thing? It is exactly that. It is the productive forces of that society. So first and foremost, the differences in the different stages of society also depend on geographic and material conditions. So environment did not permit the various human tribes to make practical use to an equal extent of their capacity to invent. Take, for example, this wonderful book called Guns, Germs and Steel, in which Jared Diamond talks about why the American continent, the Native Americans, remained more or less in the Stone Age when the Eurasian continent was already not only in the Iron Age, but much further than that even, right? And when these two civilizations collided, of course the iron civilization with iron steel weapons, steel civilization I should say, steel weapons, and the other side with wood and stone weapons, who do you think won? Naturally the Spanish and the Portuguese and the British and the Germans and so on and so forth, and the French of course, they wiped out the Native Americans, completely wiped them out. Why did they not develop? It's not because they were not more inventive, says Marx. It's because actually the conditions of life on the American continent were very, very different. They had no pack animals, for example. They had no cows, for example. Natural habitat of the Red Indians was very different from the habitat here. And so it was harder for them to develop those things. And here you had so many different civilizations interacting and learning from each other. The Chinese invent one thing, the Arabs learn from them, the Indians invent one thing, somebody else learns from them, the Africans invent something, somebody else learns from them, we're all learning from each other. So this side of the world outstripped that side of the world, and then when the two worlds collided, this side of the world pretty much, unfortunately, destroyed that side of the world. So firstly, you have to look at the physical conditions. That's the first thing. But then, for every given people at every given period of its history, the further development of its productive forces is determined by their condition in the period under examination. So as the conditions, you have natural conditions, and then they develop these natural conditions unevenly because those natural conditions are not all even. Some people live in deserts and other people live in the Nile Valley, and some people live in very Zarkhe Zameen and other people live in the middle of Balochistan. They're very uneven. But then as they all develop, but develop at different speeds, and then the further development of those things depend on the previous development of those things, because it's going to obviously, the new development of things is going to be only on the basis of the old development, and that's how history, he says, proceeds. So in the social production of their life, men enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. It's not that you think about, oh, I'm going to do this kind of society. No. It's the needs of society that determine what kind of work you're going to do, what kind of society you have to create to survive, and so on. Relations of production which correspond to a definite stage of development of their material productive forces. And then you progress, and as you progress, this kind of society you build is also heavily dependent on the kind of technology, productive forces, etc., tools, implements, industry, manufacture that you have. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society. Put all these relations together, that's the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which rises a legal and political superstructure. So where does the superstructure come from? जिसके ऊपर वो ideas थे that are interacting, what is at the bottom of all of this? It's the productive forces of mankind. What is that third thing that is determining both those things that the French materialists and 19th century idealists were worrying about? Is it opinions that determine history? Is it environment that's determined social relations, and environment and conditions that determine history? And they're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And Marx says there's something that determines both of them. And that is the productive forces of that society determine in turn the way in which that society is economically organized. And the way in which society is economically organized is going to determine what people are thinking about, talking about, debating about, and so on.